From now on, you sleep in the garage." My husband didn't raise his voice often. That was what made it worse. When Richard yelled those words across the dinner table, the sound didn't echo. It sliced. We were sitting in our dining room in Scottsdale. The long oak table we bought 22 years ago when we thought retirement would mean more family dinners, not fewer. The chandelier above us cast a soft golden light over the roast chicken I had cooked. Steam still rose from the mashed potatoes. Our son Daniel froze with his fork halfway to his mouth. My daughter-in-law, Melissa, stared down at her wine glass like she was studying the reflection. No one defended me. Richard leaned back in his chair and repeated it, slower this time. "You heard me, Helen. The garage. I'm done pretending this is your house." I looked at him. Really looked at him. 68 years old. The man I married at 23. The man whose business I helped build from a folding table in our first apartment. The man who once cried when we couldn't afford a crib for Daniel and promised me that one day we'd own something solid. I placed my napkin neatly beside my plate. "Okay," I said. That was all. I stood up. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I didn't ask Daniel to speak. I didn't look at Melissa. I walked upstairs, packed a small overnight bag, and carried it down myself. The garage smelled faintly of motor oil and Arizona heat trapped in concrete. There was an old twin mattress against the wall from when Daniel was in high school and wanted a man cave. I dusted it off with a towel and laid down a spare quilt. Richard didn't follow me. No one did. What I did next left everyone in shock. But before I tell you that, I want to say something. I'm glad you're here. Truly. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from. I've learned that stories like mine travel farther than we think, sometimes farther than the truth ever did inside our own homes. That night, the house felt different. Not smaller, not colder, just clearer. From the garage, I could hear the muffled hum of the air conditioner kicking on every 15 minutes. I could hear the ice maker drop cubes into the freezer tray. I could hear Melissa's heels clicking across the kitchen tile long after dinner had ended. What I didn't hear was my husband checking on me. I lay there on that old mattress, staring at the exposed beams above me, and I replayed the last 6 months in my mind. Richard had started using phrases like "my house" instead of "our house." He had moved his documents into a locked drawer in his study. He had insisted on meeting with a financial advisor without me. He had grown impatient when I asked simple questions about bank transfers. At first, I thought it was pride. Men don't always age gracefully, especially not men who built their identities on control. But then Melissa started staying over more often. She and Daniel had been having renovation issues in their condo across town. At least that's what they told me. Temporary plumbing problems. Temporary delays. Temporary inconvenience. Temporary became permanent very quickly. Melissa reorganized my kitchen without asking. She suggested selling and used assets. She laughed once, lightly, and said, "You don't really need this much space at your age, do you?" At the time, I smiled. I always smiled. That was my mistake. The afternoon before the dinner, I had been setting out the good china. The cream set with the thin gold rim that my mother gave me when Richard and I celebrated our 25th anniversary. The late sun filtered through the lace curtains in the breakfast nook. Arizona light is unforgiving. It exposes dust, fingerprints, everything you miss when you're busy living. I remember running my fingers along the edge of one plate and thinking how fragile things look right before they break. Around 3 that afternoon, someone knocked on the front door. It wasn't Daniel. It wasn't Melissa. It was Claire. Claire Whitman had been our accountant for 15 years before retiring last spring. She was a widow like me, might soon be in everything but paperwork. Her gray hair was always pinned perfectly, and she carried tension in her shoulders like most women carry purses. "Helen," she said softly when I opened the door. "Do you have a minute?" There was something in her voice. Tight. Controlled. Of course, I invited her in. We sat at the kitchen table, the same one where, hours later, my husband would try to exile me. Claire didn't waste time with small talk. "I wasn't sure whether to tell you this," she began, "but I would want someone to tell me." My hands were folded neatly in front of me. I remember noticing that my wedding ring felt heavier than usual. "Tell me what?" I asked. She slid a manila envelope across the table. Inside were copies, property documents, transfer drafts, preliminary restructuring notes, Richard's signature, Daniel's name, Melissa's name, not mine. They came in for a consultation last week. Claire said carefully. They asked about transferring ownership of the primary residence into a trust. My heartbeat didn't spike. It slowed. Without me? I asked. Claire nodded once. They said you were tired of handling paperwork, that you preferred to let the next generation manage things. I let that settle. For 45 years, I had balanced every checkbook, filed every tax return, negotiated every vendor contract when Richard's small construction business was barely surviving. I wasn't tired. I was being erased. They're moving quickly, Claire added. Very quickly. I thanked her. I didn't accuse. I didn't call Richard at his office. I finished setting the table. I seasoned the chicken. I folded the napkins. And when we all sat down to dinner, I already knew something they didn't. That's why when Richard told me to sleep in the garage, I didn't argue. Because the garage wasn't the worst place they were planning to put me. They thought humiliation would break me. They thought isolation would soften me. They thought age meant confusion. They were wrong. I lay there that night on the twin mattress, listening to the house settle, and I made a decision. I would let them think I had accepted it. I would let them believe the garage was enough. In the morning, I would make a phone call. And by the end of the week, this house would no longer feel like theirs. Not even a little. I didn't come back into the house until after sunrise. In Arizona, mornings arrive quietly. The sky turns pale pink over the rooftops, and for a few minutes, everything looks softer than it really is. I folded the quilt. I smoothed the mattress. I made the garage look temporary. Inside, the house was still asleep. Richard's study door was closed. Melissa's SUV sat in the driveway. Daniel's truck was gone. He always left early when he didn't want to face something. I brewed coffee the way I always did. 2 scoops. Medium roast. No sugar. Routine is a powerful thing. It tells people nothing has changed. When Richard walked into the kitchen, he paused. He looked at me standing by the counter as if he'd forgotten I lived there. I thought you'd still be out there, he said. I slept fine, I replied. He opened the fridge, took out orange juice, avoided my eyes. That told me everything. Men who are certain don't avoid eye contact. Melissa came in next, perfectly dressed for someone who didn't have a job interview. She smiled, too brightly. Morning, Helen. Did you manage okay? Manage. As if I were a guest who had been mildly inconvenienced. I did, I said. Then I added, gently. Claire stopped by yesterday. Both of them stiffened. It was small, almost invisible, but I saw it. Richard cleared his throat. Claire? What? She had some paperwork questions. Silence. Melissa reached for her phone too quickly. Daniel wasn't there to buffer anything this time. Richard forced a chuckle. You know how accountants are? Always poking around. Yes, I said. They do tend to notice transfers. There it was. The word. Transfers. He set his glass down harder than necessary. What are you implying? Nothing, I answered. Calm. Even. Just that I'd like to be present for any discussions about this house. Melissa crossed her arms. Defensive posture. Well, technically, she said carefully, it's Dad's property. Dad. Not Richard. Positioning. I nodded once. Technically, I signed the original loan documents. Technically, I hold 51% of the company that paid for this house. The air shifted. That was the first time I had said it out loud in years. Richard stared at me. You don't even handle the books anymore. No, I said, but I still understand them. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't threaten. I simply let the facts sit on the kitchen table between us like a loaded envelope. Melissa glanced at Richard. For the first time since dinner, she looked uncertain. Good. They had assumed humiliation would make me small. They had forgotten something important. I built this life with spreadsheets and contracts, not just casseroles and Christmas dinners. I have an appointment this morning, I said, rinsing my coffee mug. Where? Richard asked sharply. With someone who reads paperwork very carefully. I picked up my purse. And this time, when I walked out the front door, no one told me to use the garage. The law office was 3 miles from my house. I had driven past it 100 times over the years and never needed to go inside. It sat between a dental clinic and a real estate agency, beige stucco like every other building in Scottsdale. Ordinary. That's what protection looks like. Ordinary. I parked, turned off the engine, and sat still for a moment. My hands were steady on the steering wheel. No shaking. No panic. I wasn't there to cry. I was there to confirm. Mr. Halpern had handled 2 estate disputes for friends of mine. Quiet man. Late 50s. Steel gray hair. The kind of attorney who listens more than he speaks. When I handed him the copies Claire had given me, He didn't react immediately. He read. And then he read again. They've drafted preliminary trust transfer documents, he said finally. But these aren't executed. Meaning? I asked. Meaning nothing has been legally moved yet. That was the first exhale I allowed myself since dinner. He tapped the page with his pen. But they were preparing to. Yes, I said. Without me. He looked up at that. Mrs. Carter, according to county records, the deed is held jointly, with survivorship. And based on these corporate filings, he turned his monitors slightly toward me. You own controlling interest in Carter Custom Builds. 51%, I confirmed. He nodded once. If that's accurate, your husband cannot transfer the property without your signature. Nor can your son override your voting rights in the company. There it was. The quiet center of the storm. They believe I don't know that, I said. He gave the smallest smile. That happens more often than you'd think. We went over everything carefully. The house, the business, the retirement accounts, the life insurance policies. Nothing had been legally altered. But intent matters. Preparation matters. Strategy matters. They were moving quickly, I said. Yes, he replied. Which suggests urgency. Or fear. Fear. Interesting word. When I left his office, I didn't feel victorious. I felt clear. I drove straight to the county recorder's office and requested certified copies of the deed. Then I stopped by the bank and asked to review the business operating agreement in person. Paper leaves trails. And trails tell stories. By the time I pulled back into my driveway, Melissa's SUV was gone. Richard's car was still there. The garage door was closed. I stood in the Arizona heat for a moment, looking at the house. They had tried to move me to the garage. But legally, they were the ones standing on very thin concrete. I walked inside calmly. Richard was in the living room, flipping through channels he wasn't watching. Where were you? He asked. Protecting what's mine, I said. And this time, I didn't lower my eyes. That afternoon, I moved my suitcase back upstairs. Not into our bedroom. Into the guest room. I didn't make an announcement. I didn't slam doors. I simply carried my things past Richard while he stood in the hallway pretending to check something on his phone. He watched me. He didn't stop me. The guest room overlooks the backyard, the small desert landscaping I designed myself. 2 Palo Verde trees. White gravel. A narrow strip of artificial turf Daniel used to practice Little League on. I set my bag down and closed the door. Separation doesn't always begin with divorce papers. Sometimes it begins with choosing a different room. That evening, Daniel came over. Melissa arrived 10 minutes after him, heels sharp against the tile again. They didn't knock. They still had keys. We sat at the dining table, the same table. No one mentioned the garage. Richard cleared his throat. Your mother seems to think we're plotting something. I looked at Daniel, not Richard. Are you? I asked calmly. Daniel shifted in his chair. He had Richard's jawline, but not his confidence. We're just trying to make things easier, Mom. You don't need the stress of managing everything. Managing everything. Interesting phrase. For 45 years, I said evenly, I managed everything. Melissa leaned forward slightly. No one's questioning that. But at this stage, it's practical to consolidate assets. Protect the future. Whose future? I asked. Silence. Richard's patience thinned. This is my house, Helen. No, I corrected gently. It's ours. Legally and contractually. I let that word hang there. Contractually. Daniel frowned. Why are you talking like this? Because you've been moving like this, I replied. I reached into my folder and placed certified copies of the deed on the table. Then the operating agreement. Paper makes arguments unnecessary. Richard didn't touch them. Melissa did. Her eyes scanned. The ownership percentages. I watched the exact moment she realized the structure wasn't what she assumed. 51%, she said before she could stop herself. Yes, I answered. Daniel looked between us. Dad, Richard's face had changed. Not anger. Not yet. Calculation. You never cared about that stuff, he said quietly. I cared enough to sign every document, I replied. The room felt smaller than it had 2 nights ago. No yelling this time. No threats about garages. Just numbers. Numbers don't raise their voices. They don't need to. I'm not signing anything, I continued. Not now? Not quietly. Not without full review. Melissa sat back slowly. Richard stared at the paperwork like it had betrayed him. Maybe it had. Because what they thought was weakness was actually ownership. And for the first time since dinner, no one suggested I sleep anywhere but inside the house. After that dinner, something shifted in the house. No one apologized. No one admitted anything. But the tone changed. Melissa stopped rearranging my kitchen. Daniel stopped calling it Dad's place. And Richard stopped using the word garage. Control, when it slips, doesn't disappear loudly. It thins out. Quietly. The next morning, I received a call from Claire. I checked something else, she said. Her voice was lower than usual. There was an inquiry about restructuring the company's voting rights. I closed my eyes for just a second. Who initiated it? A junior associate sent the request. But the contact email listed Melissa. There it was. Not just property. Power. They were asking whether minority interest could be diluted through reclassification. Claire continued carefully. It would have required your consent or proof of incapacity. Proof of incapacity. I repeated the phrase slowly in my mind. They were exploring options, Claire added. No, I said quietly. They were preparing. When I hung up, I didn't feel angry. I felt awake. That afternoon, I scheduled a full cognitive evaluation with my physician. Not because I needed one. Because paper matters. Documentation matters. I drove myself. Filled out every form. Answered every question clearly. Memory recall. Pattern recognition. Financial reasoning. The doctor smiled at the end. Helen, you're sharper than most of my 68-year-old patients. I'll need that in writing, I said. He looked surprised. Then he understood. Back at home, Richard was in the study. Door closed. I knocked once and walked in without waiting. We need to clarify something, I said calmly. He looked up, guarded. No one will be speaking on my behalf. Not to attorneys. Not to accountants. Not to banks. Not to anyone. His jaw tightened. You're overreacting. No, I said. I'm documenting. That word unsettles people. Documenting. Melissa entered halfway through the conversation, pretending she'd just arrived. I think we're all just trying to avoid confusion, she said. Then let's avoid it properly, I replied. Everything in writing. All meetings scheduled with me present. Any financial inquiry routed directly to my email. Daniel stood behind her, silent. I looked at my son. You don't have to choose sides, I told him gently. But you do need to understand the facts. He swallowed. And for the first time since this began, I saw doubt in his eyes. Not about me. About them. That night, I moved my documents into a locked cabinet in the guest room. Not hidden. Just secured. The garage had been their attempt at humiliation. The paperwork had been their attempt at removal. They underestimated something simple. I wasn't fighting for comfort. I was protecting control. And now, they knew I understood the game. The difference was, I had been playing it longer. 3 days passed without another explosion. No shouting. No ultimatums. Just quiet strategy. That's how you know something isn't over. It's recalculating. Richard stopped eating dinner at the table. He carried his plate into the living room. Melissa came and went without small talk. Daniel texted me instead of knocking on my door. The house wasn't divided by walls. It was divided by information. On Thursday morning, I received an email notification from the bank. A meeting request. Subject line, Business Structure Review. Participants, Richard Carter. Melissa Carter. Senior Financial Advisor. Notably absent? Me. They had scheduled it for Friday at 10 a.m. I didn't call to confront them. I forwarded the email to Mr. Halpern. Then I replied all. I will be attending. As majority shareholder, my presence is required. Short. Clear. Documented. Melissa responded within 6 minutes. Oh, Helen, this was just exploratory. Exploratory. Like testing the depth of water before pushing someone in. Friday morning, I arrived at the bank 10 minutes early. I wore navy. Simple. Structured. Not soft. When Richard walked in and saw me seated at the conference table, he stopped mid-step. You didn't need to come, he said. I disagree. I answered. The advisor, a young man with polished shoes and cautious eyes, greeted us all. We sat. Folders opened. Charts displayed. Melissa began speaking first. We've been considering streamlining ownership to simplify estate planning. Streamlining. Such a gentle word for displacement. The advisor looked at me. Mrs. Carter, are you comfortable transferring primary control to your husband and son? No, I said. No explanation. Just no. Silence is powerful when it's firm. Richard shifted in his seat. Helen, this is about efficiency. Efficiency would include informing me, I replied. The advisor cleared his throat. Legally, Mrs. Carter's signature is required for any modification to controlling interest. There it was again. Paper defending me without emotion. Melissa tried once more. We're just thinking long term. So am I said calmly. Then I slid a document across the table. My cognitive evaluation. Signed. Dated. Clear. The advisor read the summary quickly. His posture straightened. I see no basis for altering authority without mutual agreement. Richard's jaw tightened. Daniel avoided my eyes. The meeting ended without signatures. Without applause. Without drama. Just halted. As we walked to the parking lot, Richard finally spoke. You're making this harder than it needs to be. I looked at him. No, I said. I'm making it accurate. He didn't answer. Because accuracy leaves no room for maneuvering. That night, I didn't sleep in the garage. I didn't sleep in the guest room either. I slept in my own bed. Richard chose the couch. Not because I forced him. Because for the first time, he understood something clearly. I wasn't the one being removed. I was the one holding the door. By Sunday, the house was quiet again. Too quiet. Daniel hadn't come by in 2 days. Melissa's car was gone more often than it was there. Richard moved through the rooms like a guest who didn't know where things were kept. Control changes posture before it changes outcome. I didn't confront anyone. I prepared. On Monday morning, I filed something they weren't expecting. Not divorce. Not yet. I filed a formal notice of corporate protection with our attorney. A clause embedded years ago when we first incorporated Carter Custom Builds. Back when Richard was still grateful. The clause was simple. In the event of internal dispute, majority shareholder may freeze structural changes pending independent review. 51%. That number had carried weight. For decades. Now it carried consequence. Mr. Halpern sent formal notification to all listed stakeholders, including Richard and Daniel, that no restructuring, asset dilution, or voting modification could proceed without written approval from me and legal oversight. Paper travels faster than gossip. By noon, Richard was standing in the doorway of my office. You froze the company? He asked. I protected it, I replied. You embarrassed me. No, I said calmly. You underestimated me. He stepped inside fully this time. I built that business. We built it, I corrected. And I structured it. That distinction matters. He ran a hand through his thinning hair. For the first time, he looked tired. This doesn't have to turn into a war. It already did, I said quietly. You just assumed I wouldn't show up. Later that afternoon, Daniel asked to speak with me alone. We sat on the back patio. The Arizona sun was lower now, casting long shadows across the gravel. Mom, were you really going to be cut out? He asked. I don't know how far it would have gone, I answered honestly. But it was moving. He nodded slowly. I thought Dad said you were overwhelmed. That you wanted less responsibility. I looked at my son. Did I ever give you that impression? He shook his head. There it was. The fracture. Not loud, but real. They thought I wouldn't fight, I said gently. Not because I couldn't. Because I wouldn't. Daniel stared at the ground for a long moment. I didn't know about the incapacity angle, he admitted. I believed him. Melissa had ambition. Richard had pride. Daniel had trust. And trust is easy to redirect. That night, I locked my office door. Not out of fear. Out of clarity. They had tried humiliation. They had tried paperwork. They had tried narrative. Now they understood something they hadn't before. I wasn't reacting. I was structuring. And the structure favored me. By midweek, the air inside the house had changed. Not tense. Measured. Richard stopped making casual statements about long-term planning. Melissa stopped using the word streamline. Daniel stopped repeating phrases that weren't his. When strategy fails quietly, people retreat quietly. But retreat doesn't mean surrender. It means recalibration. On Wednesday evening, Richard asked if we could talk properly. That phrase usually means someone wants to regain ground. We sat in the living room. No wine. No raised voices. Just intention. I don't understand why you escalated this, he began. Freezing the company was extreme. I matched the pace, I replied. He leaned forward. You made it look like I was trying to steal from you. You tried to move control without consent. That's not stealing. It's bypassing, I said calmly. And bypassing is rarely innocent. Melissa entered halfway through the conversation. She didn't sit immediately. She stood near the fireplace, arms folded. We were trying to protect assets, she said. You're taking this personally. I looked at her. It is personal, I answered. It's my name on the deed. My signature on the formation documents. My retirement. Richard exhaled sharply. So what do you want? Clarity. Not apology. Not revenge. Clarity. I want formal transparency, I said. Quarterly financial disclosures. No restructuring discussions without written notice. And if estate planning is happening, I'm present. Melissa's jaw tightened. That's excessive. No, I said. It's governance. Daniel stepped in then. Maybe we should slow down, he said carefully. This escalated fast. It had, because they expected compliance. And instead, they met structure. That night, I did something else. I updated my will. Not out of spite. Out of precision. Majority interest in the company would remain in a controlled trust. Conditions attached. Voting rights protected. No automatic transfer. No emotional overrides. Paper doesn't care about dinner arguments. Paper only cares about signatures. On Friday morning, a courier delivered copies to Richard and Daniel. Melissa wasn't listed as a recipient. That detail mattered. When Richard confronted me, his tone wasn't angry. It was unsettled. You're rewriting everything. I'm safeguarding everything, I corrected. You don't trust us. I held his gaze. Trust requires consent. Consent requires honesty. Silence. He looked older in that moment. Not weaker, just aware. The garage comment had been an attempt at humiliation. The paperwork had been an attempt at erasure. But now, something else was happening. They were realizing this wasn't about sleeping arrangements. It was about authority. And authority, once asserted calmly, is very hard to strip away. I wasn't fighting anymore. I was defining terms. And for the first time since that dinner, they were listening. The following week, something unexpected happened. Melissa stopped coming over. Not completely, but noticeably. Daniel came alone on Tuesday evening. He didn't use his key this time. He rang the doorbell. That detail told me more than anything. He could say, we sat at the kitchen table, just the two of us. He looked tired. Mom, I didn't know about the trust draft, he said quietly. I studied his face. There was no defensiveness there. Just confusion. I believe you, I said. He exhaled. Melissa said it was standard estate planning. That it would simplify things. Dad agreed. Simplify for whom? I asked gently. He didn't answer right away. That's what I'm trying to figure out, he admitted. For the first time since this began, he wasn't repeating someone else's language. He was thinking. I need to ask you something, he continued. If Dad hadn't pushed the garage thing, would you have frozen the company? Honest question. Yes, I said. He blinked. Why? Because preparation reveals intent, I replied. And intent was already moving. He nodded slowly. Later that night, Richard came into the kitchen while I was making tea. I spoke to Daniel, he said. I assumed you would. He leaned against the counter. Melissa feels attacked. I responded to actions, I said calmly. Not feelings. He didn't argue. Instead, he did something different. He sat down. You think I was trying to replace you, he said. I think you were trying to reposition me, I answered. There's a difference. Replacement removes. Repositioning diminishes. He stared at the table for a long time. I didn't think you'd fight. That was the most honest sentence he had spoken in weeks. I didn't either, I said quietly. Silence settled between us. Not hostile, just real. The next morning, I received a notification from our attorney. Melissa had requested copies of the corporate bylaws. Separately, without Richard. Interesting. When pressure exposes structure, people reassess their alliances. By Thursday, Daniel called again. Mom, we need to talk about something else, he said. There's more. Yes. He hesitated. Melissa's been looking at assisted living facilities online. For you. I didn't react. I didn't gasp. I didn't shout. How long? I asked evenly. A few months, he admitted. Before the trust draft. There it was. The larger picture. Garage. Trust. Voting rights. Incapacity. Assisted living. Step by step. Not chaos. Strategy. I ended the call and sat very still. Not because I was hurt. Because I was calculating. They hadn't just been testing ownership. They had been planning relocation. And relocation without consent is not care. It's removal. That night, I opened my laptop. Not to cry. Not to search facilities. But to schedule one more meeting. Because if they were thinking long-term, so was I. The meeting was scheduled for Monday at 9 a.m. Not at the house. Not at the bank. At the corporate attorney's office downtown. I sent the invitation myself. All parties required. Richard responded first. What is this about? Clarity, I replied. Melissa didn't answer at all. Daniel texted me privately. Is this about the assisted living thing? Yes. There are moments in life when you can either explode Or you can document. I chose documentation. When we sat down in the conference room, the atmosphere was different from the bank meeting. Less polished. More serious. Mr. Halpern was present. So was an estate planning specialist I had retained independently the previous week. Two professionals. Neutral. Prepared. Richard looked irritated. Melissa looked cautious. Daniel looked uneasy. I asked everyone here because there seems to be confusion about my capacity and long-term residence. I began calmly. No shaking. No anger. Just language. Melissa crossed her arms. No one said you weren't capable. I slid a folder across the table. Printed screenshots. Search history. Facility inquiries. Email exchanges between Melissa and a placement consultant. Dated. Timestamped. Forwarded to me accidentally when Daniel synced a shared device. Paper reveals what pride denies. Richard's face drained of color. Melissa tried to speak. It was just research. For whom? I asked gently. Silence. For whom? I repeated, without my knowledge. Daniel stared at the table. I didn't know it went that far, he said quietly. I believed him. Because ambition rarely announces itself as cruelty. It announces itself as efficiency. The estate specialist spoke next. Mrs. Carter is legally competent. There is no basis for involuntary transition without medical declaration. That word hung in the air. Involuntary. Melissa shifted in her chair. We were thinking ahead. So was I said. Then I placed the final document on the table. A conditional restructuring of my will. Effective immediately. If any family member attempts to initiate residential relocation, financial dilution, or legal guardianship without my written consent, they forfeit inheritance rights tied to my controlling interest. Not revenge. Consequence. Richard looked at me like he was seeing someone new. You would disinherit your own family? He asked. I would protect myself, I replied. There's a difference. The room was quiet. No one yelled. No one stormed out. Because this wasn't drama. It was structure. Melissa finally broke. This is extreme. No, I said softly. What was extreme was planning my removal while I was still paying the mortgage. That ended it. Not because I won, but because the assumptions ended. When we left the office, Richard didn't walk ahead of me. He walked beside me. And for the first time since that dinner, no one mentioned the garage. No one mentioned assisted living. No one mentioned restructuring. Because now they understood something clearly. I wasn't reacting anymore. I was setting terms. And this time, they had no counteroffer. After that meeting, no one spoke during the drive home. Richard kept both hands on the steering wheel. Daniel stared out the window. Melissa checked her phone, but didn't type. Silence can mean anger, but sometimes it means recalculation. When we pulled into the driveway, Richard turned off the engine and didn't move. You blindsided us, he said quietly. I responded to what I discovered. I replied. He looked at me, not defensive this time. You really thought I'd let them put you somewhere? I held his gaze. You told me to sleep in the garage. That ended that argument. We walked inside separately. For the next few days, something subtle shifted. Melissa stopped coming over unannounced. Daniel called before visiting. Richard stopped holding private conversations behind closed doors. It wasn't affection. It was awareness. On Thursday evening, Richard knocked on my office door. Knocked. I've been thinking, he said. That's good, I replied. He almost smiled. I let things get out of control. Melissa pushes hard. Daniel trusts easily. I thought simplifying everything would avoid future fights. And instead, I asked. It created one. He sat down across from me. I never planned to put you anywhere against your will. Intent isn't the same as preparation, I said calmly. Preparation tells the truth. He nodded slowly. That was the first real acknowledgement. No excuses. No deflection. Just recognition. Later that night, Daniel asked if we could all have dinner together. At the table. The same table. No tension this time. No performance. Melissa spoke carefully. I overstepped, she said. I thought I was protecting Daniel's future. At the expense of mine? I asked. She swallowed. I didn't see it that way. I do, I said gently. No raised voice. No humiliation. Just clarity. I won't apologize for protecting myself, I continued. And I won't be repositioned quietly. Daniel reached across the table and touched my hand. I'm sorry, Mom. That mattered. Richard looked at me. We'll redo the estate plan, he said. Together. Not because I demanded it. Because the alternative was worse. Losing trust entirely. That night, I returned to our bedroom by choice. Not because things were fixed. but because boundaries were now understood. Control doesn't have to be loud. It just has to be visible. And for the first time since that dinner, I felt something steady again. Not romance. Not victory. Stability. They had tried humiliation. They had tried paperwork. They had tried quiet removal. But in the end, what stopped them wasn't anger. It was structure. And structure, once respected, changes everything. It's been 3 months since the night Richard told me to sleep in the garage. 3 months since I carried a quilt past my own dining table. 3 months since I realized humiliation is often just a test. The estate plan has been rewritten. Together. Every clause reviewed line by line. No private drafts. No exploratory transfers. No conversations that begin without my name on the calendar. Carter Custom Builds remained structured exactly as it was. Majority interest intact. Voting protections in place. Succession defined by consent, not convenience. Daniel attends every quarterly review now. He asks questions. Real ones. Melissa sits beside him, quieter than before. Not diminished. Just aware. Richard doesn't use the phrase "my house" anymore. He says "our home." That matters. Not because words fix everything, but because words reveal thinking. And thinking is what almost removed me. The garage is still there. Same concrete floor. Same faint smell of oil and Arizona heat. I walked into it last week to store a box of old holiday decorations. I stood there for a moment, remembering that night. I wasn't angry. I wasn't hurt. I was clear. That sentence, "From now on, you sleep in the garage," wasn't really about a mattress. It was about testing whether I would shrink, whether I would accept repositioning, whether age meant surrender. It didn't. What I did next didn't leave everyone in shock because I yelled. It left them in shock because I didn't. I documented. I froze structural changes. I updated my will. I protected my capacity. I set consequences. Calmly. Without spectacle. Without revenge. That's the part people misunderstand. Strength at this stage of life doesn't look dramatic. It looks deliberate. Richard and I are not the same as we were before. Something cracked. But something else was built. Respect, this time. Not assumption. Daniel calls more often now. Not to manage me. To check in. Melissa no longer speaks about simplifying assets. She speaks about collaboration. It's different. And as for assisted living facilities, the only one I've toured recently was for a charity board I sit on. On my terms. The house is quiet tonight. The chandelier above the dining table casts the same golden light it did that evening. The oak table is still solid. So am I. If you've listened this far, I want you to remember something. Sometimes the moment someone tries to move you out of your place is the moment you discover exactly how firmly you stand in it. They thought the garage would humble me. Instead, it reminded me who signed the deed. And more importantly, who never stopped owning her own mind.